So how do you show the offence of controlling and coercive behaviour? Well, it's important to remember that it's the behaviour of the perpetrator, not the victim here. And it's behaviour that happens on a continuous basis. So a one-off is unlikely to demonstrate sufficiently that a victim's been subject to controlling and coercive behaviour. The types of behaviour we're talking about here are things like threats of rape, not being able to control their own finances, a victim being isolated from their peer group, their friends, their work colleagues. There may be threats made against a victim's ability to see children. There may be threats made against a victim's family should they not be doing what the perpetrator requires them to do. But the key element is that it's continuous. It's that constant threat made against the victim. It has to place the victim at serious alarm, and the offence has to have occurred on at least 2 occasions. I suspect for many victims that won't be difficult to demonstrate, but it is key to remember that the controlling and coercive behaviour does have legal requirements to it. So you are looking at a continuous pattern of behaviour causing alarm to the victim and must have happened on at least 2 occasions. Now, in relation to the victim, they have to be a close person. So it isn't simply somebody that is threatening them that they happen to know or they happen to be acquainted with. It has to be either a family member, partner or former partner. That falls in line with the domestic violence and domestic abuse legislation, including the issues of non-molestation orders. So it's important when you have victims approaching you in relation to this behaviour, if you are considering whether controlling or coercive behaviour applies, you need to consider what the link is between the victim and the perpetrator, because it may be that whilst there is psychological abuse ongoing, which is essentially what controlling and coercive behaviour is, it may not be the offence of controlling and coercive behaviour. It may be another criminal act that is being committed that needs to be reported to the police and dealt with in a slightly different way or a completely different way, depending on the person and the impact it's having on the victim. The offence of controlling and coercing behaviour can take place anywhere. I think often we consider domestic abuse to be a behind closed doors issue, but in relation to controlling and coercive behaviour, it can happen at any point and can happen at any place. Victims can be harassed or can be caused fear within their own workplace simply through a phone call or a text message. It can happen online simply by knowing that their abuser is using their Facebook profile, has access to their online accounts. It can happen while they're out shopping. Essentially, this offence has no boundaries at all. It's also important to remember that whilst we talk about controlling and coercive behaviour, if you are dealing with a victim who is under 18, then child protection procedures would apply, and it would then be a matter for the CPS whether or not to prosecute a perpetrator should they be older than the victim. That can become a bit of a grey area. The issue of controlling behaviour by a family member or an intimate partner for a child who is between 16 and 18 can become a difficult blur for professionals. But it is important to remember that if you are dealing with a victim who is under the age of 18, then you need to be involving the local authority, making appropriate referrals so that appropriate child protection procedures can take place in order to safeguard the victim. It may also be necessary to use child protection procedures should the perpetrator be under the age of 18 also. One last point before we move on is in relation to offender behaviour. Perpetrators of domestic abuse are often very, very good at persuading authorities that there is nothing happening, that there is no offence taking place, and that the victim is essentially making it all up. I think we're all aware of cases where domestic abuse has occurred and victims find it very, very difficult to come forward and to explain what has happened, because they do live in fear of the repercussions and they are concerned if there are children involved. Offenders become very good at persuading authorities that they are not offenders, that they're not perpetrators and they're not abusers. They can make arguments that the complaint is vexatious, that the complaint against them is because they really are the victims and not the perpetrator in all of this. They can very adeptly turn the tables on a victim, and if you're not aware that that is the level of coercion and the level of manipulation that abusers will go to, it can be very easy to fall into the trap of falling between who do you believe, the victim or the alleged abuser. So I urge caution when dealing with offenders, and urge caution in relation to the tactics that may be used in relation to a victim. Again, the CPS has procedures in place, the police have procedures in place, and you'll find within the statutory guidance in the resource section of the website, this is set out in there and gives you clear pointers to further reading if you're interested in how the CPS will deal with offenders and will deal with the potential vexatious issues that can arise out of this. So we've looked already at what the offence is, and we've looked at the elements that can make up the offence. And now want to look at the signs you might see being shown by a victim, and then we'll also look at the signs you might see from a perpetrator too.